Hello, and welcome to Literacy Matters Empowered Conversations. I'm your host, Dr. Cheryl Lundy Swift, and I am super excited for you to listen and learn from Dr. Anna Taboada Barber. Dr. Barber studies reading comprehension from a cognitive and motivational perspective. Her work centers on studying the influence of specific motivational variables like autonomy support or self-efficacy, and cognitive variables like executive functioning skills or inference making. Now, those are all on the literacy and language development of elementary and middle school students. She studies reading comprehension within classroom instructional contexts as well as an individual difference variable. As a former English as a second language teacher in full language immersion settings, Anna's work in reading comprehension development is principally concentrated within the population of emergent bilinguals within the United States. Anna, I'm so excited to have you on the show. Welcome. Anna, can you tell us about your background and experience in working with linguistically diverse students?
Sure. First of all, as you just share with your listeners, I'm a former ESL teacher. That stands for English as a Second Language, and I taught the elementary grades, first, third, fourth, and seventh grade. That's a middle school grade, mostly in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And these were children who were learning English as their second language, but importantly, they were in immersion settings. That means that they were learning content and they were learning to read in Spanish and in English.
Yeah.
So they were also reading. I would teach social studies. I would teach science in English. They would cover some of these topics in the morning in Spanish and then learn in these areas or these domains in the afternoon in English. And then I came as a grad student to the United States because I was very curious and interested in those children who were either disengaged or not motivated to read in either language, or who struggle for cognitive reasons in either language. So my curiosity was very much piqued, and my motivation to learn more was, how do I help those children who struggle with what they read, but also who seemingly don't care about reading? In other words, they shut down, their head is down. They might have all the skills to read, but they struggle with their reading because they are disengaged from reading. And that brought me to grad school, and many, many years later to where I am now at the University of Maryland.
Wow. Oh, that's really incredible. It's great work. And I love that we're referring to these children as linguistically diverse, right? So, Anna, since you have been working with these children, what do you find are the most common challenges that linguistically diverse students face when learning to read and write in a new language?
Yeah, and I'll refer to them as linguistically diverse or emergent bilinguals as well, because bilingualism is an important, very important area of my work, and I treat it as an asset, right? And I think you brought up to me the idea that these children were linguistically gifted. And I very much approach the reading and the literacy development and the research that I do as an asset perspective, where we're really thinking that these children, yes, they have challenges and they struggle because they are learning in a second language, English. They are not learning the language, but they are at the same time learning in a second language, but they also bring a set of assets. So I start with the challenges. Research in the United States with emergent bilinguals or linguistically diverse students has consistently shown over the past 2 or 2.5 decades that the core of their struggles in reading are mostly within reading comprehension. In other words, these children seem to be okay in the earlier grades, and if they are explicitly taught phonics or decoding, as all children need, they seem to be doing well. But as of third grade, approximately, with some differences, these children, emergent bilingual students, tend to diverge from their English monolingual peers, or children who speak English at home and at school. And they show struggles with comprehension, reading comprehension, understanding, making meaning of text. And that has been shown on our national assessment of educational progress. We know that these students consistently are below their grade in comparison to English monolingual peers. And we also know that they struggle with math, but they mostly struggle with those areas in math where they have to read. So word math problems. So clearly language and the learning of the language is a struggle for many of them. When we look at some very good research designs, we also, meaning that they pay attention to a lot of the details that should go into the research design, and how we conceptualize or treat these students as part of our groups or samples of students that we are focusing on, we find that if emergent bilingual students have relatively English proficiency in kindergarten, they tend to do as well or better by the time they reach the upper elementary grades, fifth grade, as their English monolingual peers. So clearly, the learning of the language and they're having to learn in the language, content in the language, poses struggles for their comprehension, mostly their reading comprehension and literacy. However, as I said earlier on, it's important also to keep in mind that learning, all children can learn more than one language. They all come equipped to that, except with some exceptions, right? With some atypically developing children that have very specific challenges. But the majority of children can develop and can be nurtured, and I would actually, research tells us that, and as a teacher, that those EBs, those emergent bilingual students or linguistically diverse students that come with oral language in their first language or in their home language, or literacy in their home language, tend to do much better in English than those children that don't. So I'm a big advocate for supporting emergent bilinguals' first language as much as possible and as much as the infrastructure of a school or a community can afford.
Wow, so you mentioned, I mean, this is all just fascinating. You mentioned this concept of the student's home language having some kind of influence. How does it actually influence literacy development in a second language?
So, of course, research has looked at this in terms of what is the first language, and there is some variation in terms of findings. Depending on what the first language is. We know that in the United States, in our public schools, we have approximately 70% of the students who are emergent bilinguals come from Spanish home backgrounds, Spanish-speaking home backgrounds. So the similarities between the first and the second language, or the differences, can help in terms of influencing that learning. But we also know that there are if you will, levers or tools that children and students can benefit from that cut across languages. In other words, we know that in their cognition, for instance, teaching them comprehension strategies, such as questioning text or activating background knowledge or using that knowledge when they are reading text. That is beyond the specific language. So as I said earlier, if these children have some tools in their first language or are practicing tools in both languages, tools if you want, or skills, that is a good way in which the first language can influence the second language. Then of course we can talk about the word level, right? And we know that when we are talking at the word level, for instance, there are what we call cognates and linguists and educators. And we know that those cognates are words that have similar meaning and oftentimes similar spelling because of their Latin roots. So, for instance, one concept that has been thoroughly studied in the last decade is that of morphological awareness, making students aware of prefixes and suffixes. Well, that can be very helpful across languages too. When we think of the ending of specific words such as tion, shon, station, transportation. There are many words that are similar in English and in Spanish. And bilingual children can benefit from that bridging, if you wish, between English and Spanish, and those prefixes that are similar. And some great work has emerged over the years in terms of how to use or leverage those cognites and word level skills that emergent bilinguals can benefit from, and the influence of one language over the other.
It's incredible the connections, right? And I've seen children. I had a fantastic Spanish teacher at my old high school where I was principal, and she just did a phenomenal job of making sure that children understood the connections to the language.
Exactly.
And again, I think it becomes, and when they become more confident in seeing those connections, I think that the learning just happens, right? Faster even. So when we
Yeah.
think about, these families, Anna, are there specific barriers for families of linguistically diverse students when they're supporting their literacy development at home, you think?
Yeah, I think, and the research also shows, and this is the case not only for linguistically diverse students, but also for other families, of course. I think the research shows that it's difficult for parents because of lack of time or because of multiple jobs and the many demands that parents and teachers have. And I want to give a quick shout out for teachers of all students, but also those teachers that have large numbers of bilingual students in their classrooms, because they can't always afford to support the children's multiple diverse languages. So I think in terms of barriers, or let's put it in terms of barriers that can be overcome. It's
Yeah.
important for these parents to know that the support of that first language and literacy related activities in that first language um, it's very important at home. Can parents support them in English? Sure, but if emergent bilingual students are in English only settings or in English monolingual settings at school, it's a good idea to actually support the learning and the content learning. So when I'm in schools and when I work with teachers and parents, whether these are schools that are language immersion schools or dual language or bilingual schools or monolingual schools, I'm a big proponent of empowering parents to say, well, if children are learning a certain topics in social studies or in science, and science is a big one because that's an area where kids get very motivated, especially in the elementary grades. So, and they are reading information texts in science. It's a good idea, to the extent possible, to support that learning at home. So if they're learning about the Arctic tundra and they are reading about polar bears, or they are reading about, lemmings, it's a great idea to support that reading. And school libraries have more and more materials in terms of increasing numbers of materials in terms of more than one language. I also think that the industry of information text has grown exponentially in the last decade.
Yeah.
So I would say that perhaps a barrier that can be converting into a positive or something that parents can do is support that content learning that is happening in literacy in English in the second language at home.
I can't say enough that that is so important for, I just want to, and thanks for the shout out for teachers, right? They need it. All the shout outs in the world. So thank you for doing that. One of my really dear friends talks about, she's a Chinese American, first generation here, and her parents, she would say, spoke what they call broken English. So they wouldn't speak in English to her, but she would come home and have to tell them in Mandarin, what she learned in school in English. And she said, and as a result of it, she has a perfect accent in both languages. and um,
Wonderful.
and she said she would really do very well academically because it was just the knowledge she was learning was just being solidified as she would explain it to her family, and they would ask her questions that she would kind of become the teacher in a different language, which is pretty amazing.
That's a wonderful explanation and description of what happens to many of these children.
Yeah.
And I don't know about your particular friend, but I would probably posit that, for her, as it is the case for many of our emergent bilinguals, um, the language we speak at home, it's got to do with our identity and who we are as people in general, but also as learners and as readers. So I think that children are equally proud of their home language, or can become proud of their home language, very much because of how parents approach that home language,
Sure.
or as is the case of your friend, what we do, what we learn in school and convey to our families in that first language. So I think it's both. It's the second language as much as the first language that can become a source of who identity and who we are as learners and as readers.
Sure, of course. So we've given families some strategies, which is great to think about really making sure that they're thinking about both the first and second language, right? As a tool to support children in understanding what they're reading and really, I think, motivating them also to read. What do you think about teachers? What are some instructional strategies that you have found have been most effective when we are thinking about supporting our linguistically diverse children?
Sure. Well, I think teachers, as we said earlier, have a lot on their plates, and especially with the advent of the science of reading, we definitely go back to well, not the advent, but the implementation and all the influence and impact that it's having in classrooms. We know that it's important that we go back to the foundational um, literacy skills. We also know that the science of reading is not just that, but there has been a huge emphasis on that. So it's important to know that these children, emergent bilingual students, need those foundational skills in English, just like their English monolingual peers or English only speaking peers. So explicit instruction of that is key. But as I said earlier, most of their challenges come when they are dealing with comprehension.
Hmm.
So I want to redouble the importance of oral language development, not only in terms of vocabulary, but also in terms of opportunities to use language meaningfully. So the importance of conversations around or about text meaningfully, that's what I go back to. Meaningfully is important to have conversations about text using terms that come from text and that can be explained in everyday language um, with peers. So text discussion or text-based discussion, and many teachers do this anyway, but for these students it's especially important that
Yeah,
those opportunities to be in mixed language groups where they are, not the pull-out model, but where they are with their English speaking peers.
yeah,
And this is across the grades. This is, it's not only in the early grades, but it's also in the later grades.
sure.
Um, Explicit reading comprehension instruction. We talked about the importance of comprehension strategy instruction, text-based questioning, activating background knowledge, and bringing that knowledge to what we read, identifying text structures, all of those strategies that we studied, that came of age, if you wish, in the 80s and 90s, thanks to the cognitive revolution, and that we have lots of studies that have shown that good readers use them naturally, but those children who struggle with reading need them explicitly taught
Yeah.
until they become automatic. Same for emergent bilingual students. And then I would say in general, teachers, not all teachers may have this opportunity, depends on the language settings that they are. But whenever possible, as we said earlier, try to build competence across languages. So whatever they can do to empower families to support the learning that is happening in school in their home language, I like to repeat that again. So empower families. School communities can become, and teachers can become very important voices in how
Yeah.
families treat their first language.
Yes, yes, and yes. As you were talking, I had this image of a student who came to our school. He had a traumatic experience in Dominican Republic, which caused him and his dad to have to move here. He spoke no English, zero. And I remember his teachers feeling really overwhelmed because he just wasn't speaking in class at all, in any language for that matter. And I remember them coming to me and saying, "What can we do?" And so I said, "Well, I want you to come down with me to the cafeteria." And they were like, Okay. Why do I go to the cafeteria? We go down there and we see this young man engaging in conversation with his peers. We used to have like games in the cafeteria, so we had these big Uno cards, which he just fell in love with because they were just gigantic. And we noticed that he was talking in English as much as he could, as well as in Spanish with his peers, some who were English speaking, some only, and some who were Spanish and English speaking. And so I can't say enough how important the opportunities to speak to peers is.
Exactly.
How he was picking up language by playing a game in the cafeteria.
Mhm.
And so they were really amazed. So this little trip to the cafeteria showed them that one, he's not like not speaking. He's just not speaking right now in this setting. But I think when he saw them and they began to engage and play Uno with him in the cafeteria, he began to feel more comfortable and wanted to take more risks in the classroom. So
Exactly.
I want to encourage people out there who feel like maybe their children are not talking enough to just examine your practice to see if in fact there's enough opportunities for them to just talk to students, you know.
Natural.
Sometimes, they need that conversation, with their peers. So make sure that there's enough time to do that. So now you mentioned like that obviously teachers are overwhelmed. I think sometimes they've got a lot of mandates. And when we think about teaching literacy, how does one really balance the teaching of literacy, but also kind of build confidence when it comes to children learning a second language?
Well, as you know, my a lot of my work has been around the motivation and engagement of all children, but especially students who are emergent bilinguals, because these students struggle with their sense of competence.
Yeah.
And competence or confidence, another term that has been used a lot in the motivation research literature, is that of self-efficacy, right? And efficacy, it's this idea that comes from psychology, and it started a long time ago with Albert Bandura within social cognitive theory, and it refers to an individual, so to a person's belief in their capacity to act in the ways that they are needed in order to reach a specific goal. And different from, for instance, self-concept, self-efficacy is very task specific. So there are lots of things that teachers can do to build or to support students' efficacy and competence around reading or self-efficacy, reading self-efficacy or reading competence. And one of those has to do, like your very nice example of the cafeteria, has to do with providing mastery experiences. We all like to feel good about something that we think we do well, right? And a lot comes from practice, as one of your guests said in I think it was Karen Harris. She mentioned the importance of practice makes progress, not necessarily perfect. And I love that because behind this, there is this idea that we ought to encourage practice and time on tasks where students need the opportunity to feel successful. And
Yeah.
that's what you did with the cafeteria experience. The same can be done with reading. So providing opportunities where students can feel successful in reading tasks is key. Whether that's tweaking or providing texts that are more at the reading at the level of the student, reading level of the student, that is high content but perhaps easier readability, but that yet push the students to learn from the text, right? Because that's the idea. Learning the skills and the strategies that we mentioned before are important tools, but they're not by itself motivating. And yes, we can feel mastery about how we ask questions about text, but ultimately what's really motivating is what we learn from text.
Mm.
So this idea of allowing providing texts that allow for conceptual development, learning about a topic. Another one is providing texts that, and having in the classroom libraries, texts that are related to each other. So students can learn of a topic within a sustained or for a sustained period of time. Why? Knowledge development lends itself to mastery and that sense of I know about a topic. So
Yes,
again, if we go with example of the Arctic tundra, have multiple books about a topic that students can choose from. Choice is another one and a big contributor to reading motivation and the sense of competence. I get to choose what I read about a specific topic. So these are all practices that come from the motivation literature, but that are really intrinsically related to the activities and the tasks and the reading that children do in the classroom.
sure.
Uh, so they all contribute to competence development, to that sense of efficacy and competence.
I love that. How do you think cultural relevant teaching plays a role also when it comes to literacy development for students?
Yeah, I love the idea and the concept of and theories that are emerging about culturally relevant teaching. But I think that key to this idea of cultural relevant teaching is um, students' interests, So it's likely that, the research eventually is going to show that cultural relevant teaching is not only valuable to students because of identity and personality development and how it nurtures their sense of who they are as learners, readers, and future um, participants of our democracy, but um, it's also had to do with our interests. We like to read about the topics that we like, and we tend to become experts, going back to the mastery notion, right?
Right.
So if we like gardening and we read everything about gardening as adults. I'm very interested in history, for instance. And the more I become and I develop expertise around the topic, the better I feel about it. Same with children. So I think, or with students, I think cultural relevant teaching is important. But I also go back to what teachers can do in the classroom. It's very difficult to cater to a lot of cultures. So perhaps exploring students' interests in relation to their cultures is a good way of managing the time they have for independent reading on topics of interest to the students.
I love that. I love that. That power of choice and interest is truly incredible, right?
Yeah,
That I've had students who would not read, and you find out they really like fishing, and you give them a book on fishing or give them an assignment about fishing, and then they just light up. So,
like that.
yeah.
Exactly. We've all seen that. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So Anna, I know you've been doing a lot of work on the impact or rather the influence of executive functioning of linguistically diverse students and really their comprehension. I'd love
Mhm.
for you to talk a little bit about that and tell me what are some important takeaways for our listeners with regard to executive functioning.
Sure. So this is work I've been doing with my colleague Kelly Cartwright in the last 7 or 8 years. And we received funding from the Department of Education to do some of this work in both in with emergent bilingual students in English only settings or schools, and in settings where students are learning Spanish and English, or what other people call immersion settings or dual language schools. So the work is a little different depending on what type of school setting and the development of bilingualism, in the sense that we know that the three classic executive function skills, working memory, inhibition, and cognitive flexibility, are key to their reading comprehension. And they relate to reading comprehension in different ways and to different degrees, and they contribute to that. And Kelly Cartwright has done a lot of work on that. And our studies show similar patterns to what we find with English only speaking students, that they contribute, they are important, and they, if you wish, they function as a general or a cognitive basis for other processes that contribute to comprehension, such as fluency and orthographic mapping. And we've shown some of that in our studies. So they undergird those other components of reading that will eventually lead to successful comprehension. But the work that we've done in the last few years is in dual language or in language immersion settings with students who are learning both English and Spanish. And what we found there is that based on prior theories and work that has been done with bilinguals in Canada, mostly by Ellen Bialystok and Gigi Luke, we found that students who are bilingual, because of their bilingualism, and that goes back to the importance of fostering the two languages, because they are bilingual and their two languages are constantly active, the fact that they are bilingual fosters and nurtures their executive control of attention. So we consistently, research has found, and we're replicating these findings, that these students tend to have a heightened, if you wish, or improved control of attention and the ability to ignore distractions, thanks in part to their bilingualism. So now we're learning that speaking more than one language, it's not only important for cultural reasons and for economic reasons and for all the reasons that we all know, but we also know that it's perhaps, and evidence shows, so not perhaps, but really that that control of attention that comes from their executive function system is strengthened, or it's thanks to the fact that these bilinguals are juggling two languages at a time.
That is just fascinating. I cannot wait to read more about that. That is
Sure.
really, really fascinating. Again, so when I use the word superpower, but that really, truly is a superpower to be able to now kind of again focus. It really allows them to have a more heightened focus. That's phenomenal.
And
So,
that relates, Cheryl, to your guest. I'm sorry, to your guest, Carol, Dr. Strom,
mhm.
um, who in a very nice uh, depiction of brain cities, she shows that attention antenna, and she made a very good point. It's very difficult to disentangle, and we shouldn't be talking about it's a mistake perhaps to separate brain from the reading brain from the learning brain, and we do that in order to understand what happens in the brain. But here it's similar to that idea. This children's attention antenna is heightened because of the constant oral language they do of these two languages or more languages, and that could in time benefit their reading across languages.
wow. Well, first of all, I want to thank you for listening to Literacy Matters. You've mentioned Dr. Karen Harris and Dr. Carolyn Strom, two of my
I
favorite.
love your work. I love your podcast.
I really, really appreciate you. So, you've given us some really awesome strategies that we can do at home, that we can do at school. As we close, I would love for you to share one thing to empower school leaders, teachers, and families.
I think first I would give a shout out again to teachers, to everything they are doing to incorporate all the knowledge that is coming from science in terms of supporting reading. Um, and I think I will focus on oral language development, and to the extent that you can empower families to support the first language at home, please do so. I think that will be my ultimate message.
That is awesome. I wanted to say thank you for all the work that you are doing. I learned a lot today, and I know our listeners have too. So thank you for all that you do. We greatly appreciate you and keep up the great work that you're doing.
Thank you, Cheryl. It's been wonderful talking with you.
It's a pleasure.